Mascot horror needs no introduction to this channel, and if it does, well, you're in luck. But something that has always remained pretty true throughout our continuous discussion with this topic is the inconsistent shelf life these games could have. You know, we got our mainstays, FNAF, Poppy Playtime, The Wretched, but we also got some smaller successes that may have not completely taken off, but definitely had their time in the sun when they were needed. You could group these games in with things like Tattletale, Baldi's Basics, the earlier Wretched, but it is still possible to go even further than that. Of course, there's already a graveyard of Mascot horror games that failed to ever launch, and we got a peek of that a few months ago. But there is this very weird phenomenon of Mascot horror games that actually had a fair bit of spotlight put on them for a while, but due to a myriad of factors, we're just not able to satiate that momentum to at least be somewhat fondly remembered. So I guess there's a lot of questions to ask about these games. But I think one of the most important ones to ask is, how do they hold up to the current climate of Mascot horror? To narrow down our examples for this experiment, I chose 3 specific Mascot horror games to check out in this context. 123 Slaughter Me Street, Showdown Bandit, and Venge. For some of you, I might have rung several bells in your mind because you remember these games, but probably haven't thought about them at all before I just mentioned them right now. With one of the games containing a duology that only has faint whispers regarding it anymore, to a game from the creators of Bendy that underperformed so hard that the studio behind it had to shut down, and a game that for months was acclaimed as a borderline plagiaristic basis for Poppy Playtime. These are Mascot Horror's Forgotten Faces. We'll be playing and covering these games in the order they came out, so the first games on our list are 123 Slaughter Me Street 1 and 2. Holy shit, that's a lot of numbers for one sentence.
You are a criminal.
Dude, Slaughter Me Street.
123
Oh.
Slaughter Me Street. Now, this is a game that's inspired by Five Nights at
What
Freddy's.
is this?
And oddly reminiscent of Sesame Street.
This game is honestly really confusing the label. On one end, I think you can make a good case of this being another Mascot horror game that failed to launch like High Time or Leany Boog. But this game was popular enough to not only warrant a sequel, but to also get some prominent fan media made for it, such as a DA Games fan song with a very respectable 7.5 million views. Honestly, if you were to remember this game for anything, it's probably that song. This is how I figured out what this game even was when I was younger, and it was probably most people's drop-off point when it comes to exposure regarding this game series. But to the shock of most people who have probably listened to the song, there is a whole game attached to it we can play. And honestly, it's nowhere near as good as I thought it would have been as a kid. In all honesty, I get it. Although this isn't the first game this studio has worked on, it is the first genuine step they took into making something other than simple mobile games. Which honestly makes sense because this game looks like it could run on my TI-83 calculator. The first thing I noticed with this game is that the visuals are very bad. I'll admit, although the game certainly does have an atmosphere to it, the textures make this look like one of those knockoff Slenderman granny mobile games you'd see Think Noodles play or something. But visuals aren't the only thing that make a game good. The gameplay is what comes first for these types of experiences, and it's not great either. There's a verse in the DA Games song about this game that is literally just walk down the corridor, which is all you're going to be doing in this game. But I do have to admit, it is a bit of an acquired taste. Once you get the strategy down, it starts to feel a lot like a classic FNAF game in the sense that it's a good pattern recognition and muscle memory exercise. Throughout your journey down the corridor, you'll be facing up against 3 threats: the follower, the greeter, and the waiter. Taking on these guys by themselves is usually fine, but when they're all active at once, it can become an absolute nightmare. The first one you're introduced to is the follower, and I'm gonna be honest, I still have no idea how he works. He's really just there to incentivize you to keep moving and to not stay still a second longer than you have to. I think shining your light on him can temporarily incapacitate him, but I'm still not really sure how to utilize it correctly. Basically, with him, just keep your distance. The second puppet you're introduced to is the greeter, who incentivizes you to stop at every doorway you pass to make sure you don't get caught by her. Though I honestly think the placements of where she can spawn were really unfair at times, like she is without a doubt the hardest puppet to manage out of the bunch. In a game where the entire formula is stopping and going, you'd imagine that the transition between walking and halting would be pretty immediate and snappy. But for some reason, out of all the details to add to make the game feel more realistic, it's stopping momentum, which is an awful thing for a game like this where the difference between life and death is literal centimeters. Most of my deaths were caused for this exact reason, especially on doors that were more difficult to see as they can be placed where pillars can cover them. But thankfully, even though where they spawn is up to RNG, the level layouts themselves stay the same on every floor. So it's really just a matter of remembering the layout through trial and error. I believe on the 3rd floor is when we get introduced to the waiter. The way he alerts his presence is by doing a little growl before you approach a new door, and to get rid of him, you need to shine your light onto his face. He's definitely the easiest to manage out of the 3 puppets, and honestly serves more as an obstacle that makes the follower a little more dangerous. I've died less to the waiter himself and more to the follower when trying to take care of the waiter. We rinse and repeat this formula 7 times until we make it to the final floor, where we get to see an incredibly funny cutscene. I love how close the follower gets to us here. Like, I swear if he got even an inch closer, he would literally just clip into the camera. We get a little teaser for the 2nd game, which is quite possibly the funniest post-credit scene I have ever seen, and then the game ends. There's like these little relics that you can sometimes stumble across that give you a bit more story behind this game, though all I could figure out is that we play as a guy named Tim Denson, and we epically killed our daughter for some reason, and now we're in some hell or purgatory after falling down into an abandoned apartment complex. What? Tim Denson? Tim Denson is the best you could come up with? Come on, dude, that's like a Scott Cawthon named William Afton, like fucking Dolan Bushnell. Although the story of this game is certainly lacking and not the most original, I can appreciate that it's very bare bones and easy to understand, which is something that a lot of these games in this genre, before and after, still continue to fail to get right. In retrospect, it is honestly no surprise that 123 Slaughterby Street caught on for a little bit, especially with how little competition there was in 2015. But it certainly did not have the appropriate staying power to be able to go anywhere that far. And I think a big reason as to why is just the fact that the devs didn't really capitalize on its potential enough. I know it's something that you can criticize a lot of newer Mascot horror for, but I honestly think these guys were very ahead of the curve in their premise. The things that I believe that bogged this game down was the lack of a memorable setting, the shortness of the game, and the very little to talk about or discover once beating it. 123 Slaughter Me Street 1 is a very what you see is what you get game. The content that's there is serviceable for an amateur Mascot horror game, but it's missing some core design elements that keep it from becoming a classic in the Mascot horror scene. But there is a sequel to this game that we still have to cover. Does it improve on any of the faults of the first game?
No.
I hate this game. This may be the contender for worst Mascot horror game I have ever played. Yes, worse than Ban Ban. I think the only other game in this genre that rivals it is like either High Time or Spectator, but when that's the bar, you know you messed up exponentially. 123 Slaughter Me Street 2 is a direct downgrade from the original in almost every way possible. The visuals are somehow worse, the monster designs are a lot more forgettable, and the gameplay is just so damn boring. Like a handful of Mascot horror games, the core basis of this game is based on repetition with levels that progress in difficulty as you go on. But the formula they choose to base the gameplay around this time is really bad and really boring. Unlike the first game, we are given a fully free roam environment that the rest of the game is formed around. And this entire environment is literally just Unity stock assets galore. It honestly reminds me a lot of the environments in Ban Ban, but like somehow worse. And that is really saying something. The gameplay this time is centered all around the idea of hide and seek, which sounds like it could be utilized pretty well. Games like It Steals or the FNAF Ruin DLC arguably do a pretty job at incorporating hide and seek into a horror game like this. But this may honestly be the worst way you could have possibly implemented the hide and seek concept into a video game. Essentially, what you have to do is in this pre-game phase, look for areas of the house that light up blue when you shine your light on them. These are your hiding spots, and what you have to do is sit in them until they turn green, which makes it a safe spot. Find enough blue spots around the house to fill up this meter up here, and when you do that, this pink line will show up drawn on the floor that leads you to an orb that you can pick up. Once you pick it up, you can make your way to the exit and win. Now, imagine this copy and pasted 10 times. This is genuinely some of the least engaging gameplay design I have ever experienced. Half of the game is literally just standing completely still in one spot for seconds at a time. And it isn't like it's suspenseful or anything, because some monster designs in this game suck as well. Alright, I think it's time we talk about that. There are 3 new monsters that can spawn after the pregame is over. The Seeker, the Stalker, and the Screamer. Names and designs so forgettable that I literally had to go to the fandom wiki to remember their names. Their designs are literally just Fat Follower, Defeathered Greeter, and this guy. Yeah, he really doesn't resemble the waiter much, so I don't really know what his deal is. Avoiding them is the absolute worst as well because of how awful the controls are. I really don't know how to describe it, but if any of you know that drift that's present in a lot of amateur Unity games, yeah, that's the problem. Another thing that this game introduces is every night there will be some new gimmick that tries to make the game harder, like tricking you with blue or green light everywhere to make you memorize where proper hiding spots are and stuff. But the absolute worst one is level 8, where everything is pitch black and your flashlight is so piss poor that you can't see the threats even if they are literally 2 feet in front of you. There's really not much else to talk about with this game. I don't know, like every night this red guy shows up and says some cryptic ass sentence like he's the fucking goblin and I need to solve his 3 riddles, but like that's really it. When we finally beat the game, it's revealed through a comic strip that this is actually a prequel to the first game, and it's meant to give an explanation as to why we epically killed our daughter. But like, I still don't know. There's also collectibles that you can find that apparently explain some more stuff, but like, I'm not doing that. 123 Slaughter Me Street 2 is the game that gives me the final verdict on this series. It's bad. Like, pretty darn bad. It sucks because I honestly think there was a lot of potential for this game to succeed, but it was just not executed properly. There was a lot of effort put into a ton of the official art pieces for these games and the comic strips as well, but the games themselves were just very lacking. Surprisingly, the studio is still around though, and they are actually still making new Slaughter Me Street content, such as this remake of a retrofied version of the first game that released years ago. I have no idea if it's any good or not, but it's nice to see that despite not really being talked about at all anymore, this studio is still kicking. If they were to ever make a true third entry to this game, I'd honestly be pretty excited. It's been 7 years since the release of Slaughter Me Street 2, so seeing how much these devs could have potentially improved in that time would be really interesting to see. And with the market being very hot and competitive right now, I honestly can't think of a better time to do so. Now let's talk about a game that literally killed a whole studio. Kindly Beast is a name you may or may not recognize. Formerly known as the Meatly Games, it was the studio behind Bendy and the Ink Machine and the spin-off Boris and the Dark Survival. Not to be confused with Bendy and the Dark Revival, no, that was developed by Joey Drew Studios. You guys see something wrong here? Although this studio will still be remembered for their work on the Bendy games, the much more infamous bastard child of this studio that flopped so hard that more than 50 employees had to be laid off is also a much more interesting story in my opinion. That game is Showdown Bandit. Now, there is already over 4 hours of in-depth coverage that goes over exactly why this game failed and why Kindly Beast shut down. But to summarize it into one sentence, this game is an absolute definition of a mascot horror industry plan. Now, when I say this, I don't mean in the same way that you can argue how Poppy Playtime and Ban could be argued as industry plants. I'm talking about full-fledged marketing campaigns, merchandise on launch kind of planting. And not even in the same way that Ban or Poppy had merch on launch. I mean that you could literally go into your Walmart or Target toy aisle and see Showdown Bandit merch just sitting there collecting like a landfill because no one was buying these. And they aren't buying them still. You'd think merch for a canceled and dead game would at least have some mystique surrounding it or some niche market that would at least make some of this merch in high demand, but no! The first chapter of this game came out all the way back in 2019, and you can still find a bunch of toys toys still selling at retail price, which is absolutely absurd to me. But enough about the stuff surrounding the game, we can get back to that later. For now, let's focus on the game itself. And despite being a market failure, was it at the very least fun? No, it was actually almost as bad as Slaughter Me Street 2. This is such a painful thing for me to say, because this game literally had everything going for it except for the gameplay. The sound design, visuals, optimization, and character design are all pretty damn top-notch and what you'd expect out of the studio that made Bendy. But like a ton of Mascot horror developers, they always seem to falter on the actual gameplay part. Showdown Bandit plays nothing like how you'd expect your typical Mascot horror game to play. You aren't some mysterious employee or worker who managed to find himself in a strange situation. You play as the actual namesake of the game in a third-person isometric view. Now, this setup is really cool for a game in this genre, but it's a shame that it's not fun in the slightest. First off, the mobility. You don't move around the environment with your typical WASD keys. Instead, you need to click on wherever you wanted Bandit to walk. I believe this decision raises several problems because not only is rapidly clicking precisely where you want your character to move a lot more tedious than just controlling where they go with your keyboard, but it also means that you're at a set speed the entire time. And let me tell you, there's going to be a cure for cancer before Bandit just walks his way to the other side of the room. This game moves so slow, it's not even something that you can excuse for being part of the design, it's just not fun. One of the items we get very early on is a cork gun, which I was really excited to get the first time because I thought there'd be actual combat to this game, which is also rare for a lot of Mascot horror games. But no, this item can only be used in very specific scenarios, and all of them require you to stand on one of these platforms, which is the only way you can utilize your gun. I get that this tool is meant to be used to have you solve puzzles first and foremost, but this item just feels like such a slap in the face for how underutilized it is. Why do I need to stand on very specific platforms just so I can use my gun? Why can't I just like right click and be able to pull it out whenever I want? You actually can shoot enemies with it too, but it is such a process and so tedious to do that there's no point in doing it unless you need to clear them out to safely do a puzzle, especially when they just spawn back when you leave the room. There's money you can also find around the map that you can also use at saving or healing stations that actually have workers attached to it, which I honestly think is a pretty cool concept. Once again, showing this game had a lot of good ideas style-wise, but failed at actually delivering a fun experience first. Your goal in this game is to really just go to certain rooms by shooting bells to unlock doors with not much variety other than that. Though a mechanic I do like in this game comes in the form of a character you can randomly stumble upon named the Faceless Bandit, who works as this Mr. X type character who can follow you through multiple rooms and make his presence known to you until you slip through his grasp. I'm not sure if these encounters are random or not, but they did actually help to make some tense scenes, especially with how slow everything moves. I'll be honest, a lot of this game is kind of a blur to me after playing it for the first time. Another standout moment was this absolutely abhorrent minecart ride you need to do where you shoot a firework gun at several targets or you crash and die. For some reason, this game also gives you this area as a special unlockable after beating the game too, which just seems like a super insecure move if anything, because this is arguably the only part of the game that actually has any sort of genuine gameplay attached to it. After doing some more forgettable puzzles and exploring some of the later environments, like a mansion filled with infested spiders, we eventually get to unlock the final door of the game, which gives us this very anticlimactic ending, which makes sense since this was meant to be followed up on with the second chapter. Yeah, it was meant to be. So like I mentioned earlier, this game flopping as hard as it did was one of the things that put the entire studio of Kindly Beast into the ground. And honestly, I can kinda see why. I get what they were trying to capture here, and I can certainly see the vision. But in execution, and even just from a marketing standpoint, I feel like this game was kinda set up for failure. This game was never going to reach the same heights of popularity like Bendy did. But I think if executed more properly, early and had pressure for this game not to do so well as Bendy been put on it, I think this game could have seen a gradual improvement in chapters just like the original Bendy games did. It honestly sucks that I have to say this game was bad, since I can see the amount of effort that was put into it, and also knowing what would happen to the employees of this game after. But it just does not make for an engaging experience. And unfortunately, it's not really a shock to me that this game wasn't able to take off in the way it was expected to. With everything we had talked about up until now, even with the circumstances of these games being popular, you can still argue that their growth was at least semi-natural. Slaughterby Street just so happened to be picked up by big content creators for the time in the same vein that FNAF did. And although I claimed Showdown Bandit was an industry plan, it doesn't take away the fact that having a known studio behind you, in any case, was going to get eyes on your project. But this last game, the popularity surrounding it almost had nothing to do with the actual game itself, and rather the controversy surrounding it, and a game that would consume it in its wake. And despite being a game that was almost exclusively talked about to make points against it, no one ever really seemed to just sit down and actually play the games themselves. So, with that being said, dog, is this Huggy Wuggy? Out of all the Mascot horror games on this list, this one was probably the most interesting to me. Because if you aren't aware, back last year, Poppy Playtime was accused of plagiarizing this game during that whole controversy. And despite being one of the more prominent people to cover that story, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't actually play the game to compare. In hindsight, this was certainly a very big mistake I made when making that video. Because now, I honestly can hardly see the resemblance between this game and Poppy Playtime. If anything, it resembles Bendy and the Ink Machine way more than Poppy. But then again, both of those games take their structure from Bendy, so I guess it checks out. Out of all the games that we have played on this list, Venge is probably the best one, but I think I only say that because it frustrated me the least. Except for one part that we'll get to in just 1 second, oh don't you worry. I'd like to also point out that apparently this game is getting a full redo very soon, so the judgment this version of the game will be given may not reflect the product it will become in the future. So also keep that in mind while hearing my current rundown of events and critiques. I swear, getting to the actual game is longer than the game itself. It starts off with this animated cutscene, which is fine and all. It's pretty well animated and doesn't last for too long. But then you're thrown into this living room where you gotta go outside and grab a magazine, and the entire process just feels very sluggish. But then you are brought to the absolute worst part of this game. You need to convince this person who you are texting to be okay with you seeking off this abandoned facility, and oh my God, this sucks. You don't know what is the right option to say, and the path you need to go down is very specific and strict. I struggled on here more than literally anything later to come from this game. There's like 3 paths you can go down and several ways to get the bad ending of this interaction, which is deciding not to go. And it was an absolute slog to get through. I don't know why Mascot horror games always feel the need to throw in gimmicks like this at the beginning of the game. Give as much flack to games like Poppy or Ban all you want, but at the very least it doesn't waste your time with stuff like this. After finally getting through this texting minigame, you're thrown into another gimmick minigame where you need to bike to the facility, and come on, man. This gimmick also feels very sloppily implemented, and the controls for this part are awful. The handling of the turns feels very delayed, and the obstacles are sometimes just near unavoidable if you get unlucky. And I think Coaster even knew this, because you're given 3 chances to hit an obstacle before being failed. Finally getting to the end, you're abruptly shown this cutscene where you're in a forest and get attacked by a monster. Waking up, we can finally play the video game. Rejoice! Venge's gameplay is about what you'd expect. You walk around a spooky environment doing puzzles in hopes to progress. It is actually wild how easy this game is. Everything you need to do is told exactly to you or is put right in front of you, and it made me not have to think at all for any puzzle that I did. Like, take this ball puzzle for example. Not only is what you have to do told directly to you with 4 separate notes, but every item you grab literally glows, so you absolutely cannot miss miss it. If this was like an option, I'd understand a little bit more, but this is just how the game is, and it feels way too easy. Like, come on, Band doesn't even do this, and the only other game I know that does anything like this is Rainbow Friends. After some exploration around the facility, you set the stage where you trigger another scripted event that takes you to a dark world. Sanity now has a play in this game's mechanics, but it's pretty bare bones, just needing to press right click to blink whenever you see the screen getting shaky. The progression now is pretty simple, but you actually have the ability to take on the threats that come your way, such as this Leviathan dude called the Cartoonist, who will very slowly chase after you and possibly like throw you around in this Garden of Banban 4 looking environment. This is another case of things just becoming a blur to me, since nothing really that memorable happens. You're just kind of thrown into one event to another. At one point, you're being chased by the Cartoonist, then you go into some catacombs where you have to avoid an enemy who can't see you while you turn on generators, and then you're in Bendy. Like, there's really no consistency at all. And maybe that's the point, judging how we're supposed to be in this chaotic alternate dimension or something. But it just really left me not remembering any standout moments because of it. There's a vent chase at one point with this wolf guy who has very funny dialogue, and he dies via Roblox obby. And then there's just skeletons out of nowhere too, okay? The game ends here with an ally crushing the skeletons for us and revealing themselves to be the frog from earlier, and then Act 0 ends. After finally playing Venge for myself, I honestly have no idea how anyone thought Poppy was remotely even trying to copy the style of this game, especially with how generic the premise is by today's standards. I think both have Bendy and FNAF to thank for existing, though for the time period this game did come out, I can kinda excuse it for not being the most original game in the world. I think it does have some pretty cool ideas. The surrealist dark world and some of the monster designs are pretty neat, and I like the idea of having your playthrough change on whether or not you decide to spare or kill the monsters. But all of these attributes I feel like are not fulfilled to their fullest potential. We have a dark world, but it changes nothing to the aesthetics other than making everything less consistent. Some of the designs are kinda cool, and others look like Bendy or FNAF parody characters made to avoid copyright. And to my knowledge, deciding to spare or kill the monsters doesn't really necessarily change much in the gameplay of this act either. Maybe it will in the future, but for now it was severely underwhelming. Venge is something I hope can redeem itself, and hopefully it can make a big comeback in the space sometime soon. There's already some preview footage of the redone Act 0, and although I think a lot of these shots look better, I really hope that a lot of this stuff isn't just visual changes. I think the bike section looks like it still needs a lot of work done with it, and I'd like to see if other things like the camera bobbing could be tweaked a bit, because this game was pretty nauseating at times. So, despite the controversy that came and went for this game in the brief time it was in the public eye, I really hope that this game continues to progress as time goes on. I'll certainly be checking out the updated version when it does drop. Well, that was a fun trip down memory lane. Whether it was your first time hearing about a lot of these games in any sort of meaningful way, or if I brought back any memories you probably have forgotten, this will once again probably stand as the last time you think about any of these games for a while. Mascot horror, with it being a style that is paraded for having a severe market saturation, is bound to likely have hundreds of games in this vein. But with all of these being pre-Banban and even in a pre-Poppy era, seeing how different the landscape was at the time was a very interesting thing to examine with all the hindsight that we have now. It's no surprise why a lot of these games did get popular, but it's also no surprise why they all fell as well. While Slaughter Me Street had the backing of some prominent community figures at the time, not getting the support or effort it truly needed to live up to its potential killed the series pretty quickly. Collectively agreed to basically just be immortalized through a generic sounding DA game song. Showdown Bandit, while having immense potential at the time, with a big studio and licenses backing it in all the ways that it could, poor company management and little fanfare snubbed this game from ever reaching the potential that it truly deserved, causing it to fade into obscurity while Bendy is still collectively remembered and thought about to this day. And Venge, unfortunately, only had eyes on it due to very specific circumstances regarding another game that would go on to completely outshine it in the process. But but at least unlike the other two examples, may have the ability to redeem itself in the eyes of the public very soon. But regardless, I believe all the games that we covered today have very interesting stories attached to them, and even if they may not ever reach their peak again, hopefully videos like these help to keep them floating in the thoughts of the public conscious for even just a little longer. Alright, I'm gonna go, prepare for that inevitable Band 6 video now. You all know it's coming. I've been Dags, and until next time, see ya.
Yo.
Have you ever wanted movies free?
Oh, jeez, Rick!
Rick and Morty.